You are in a very unique position where you have so much exposure to so many different founders from so many different geographies. And something that we mentioned before we started recording was this sentiment between the UK and the US. And if you're a really ambitious founder, then the narrative at the moment is that it makes the most sense to go and be where the most ambitious founders in the world are and where the beating heart of the tech ecosystem is, which is Silicon Valley. And so we're here in the UK wanting to make the UK this hub of Europe. But where do you think the narrative of the European tech sector lends itself to that? And where do you think we're lacking?
So I don't think it's an either or. And I think there's a lot at the moment going on sort of press about it's got to be UK versus France or UK versus US. And I don't think it is this sort of just one pitting against the other. I think we have a bit of a moment right now for Europe. And there's a moment that European founders are galvanizing together and sort of focused around how do we make Europe great and how do we perhaps break down some of the barriers we've got to scaling across Europe and to making brilliant companies at the scale that they are in the US here. But there's no, most ambitious founders will look at the US at some point. It's an incredible addressable market that you wouldn't want to ignore if you've got ambition and hope for your company and growth. And naturally, right now, that's where some of the later stage growth capital and a little bit more of a risk appetite is, which perhaps you could say these are some of the biggest barriers that we've got in the UK and across Europe, which is that access to later stage capital, that appetite to probably have that amount of risk. And it is also, elements around talent and scaling. But there's no shortage of, I think, just brilliant ingredients that we've got here in the UK to be a place for entrepreneurship. And so we see it as our job to really try and bring those things to the forefront. How can we actually do a little bit more of banging the drum for the UK? We have amazing education, amazing talent, amazing academic institutions. We do have really, really good growth capital. So we are home to more VC-backed companies here than any other country across Europe. We, I think, have got really good examples and role models of previous companies that have gone that route and created some brilliant unicorn companies here in the UK. So those ingredients are here. It's now just actually a little bit, I think, around belief that we can do it and promotion. And not necessarily, not forgetting, of course, that there do need to be some finite things that we can work with our government to intervene and support on to actually create the necessary steps and tools to help founders build their companies here.
And I know you're doing great work with the government, and as we were just speaking about, our mutual contact, Alex Pledge, being brought into the government to lead entrepreneurship and help bang that drum. And so there are some systemic changes, but given that most of our audience are founders, I'd love to speak to the sort of belief system changes and the risk appetite changes that you think need to happen. What does this look like in practice when you speak to some of the most ambitious entrepreneurs? What are they saying that makes you go, that person is so hungry, that person's going to take over the world, compared to maybe some more reserved founders?
I think what we encourage the founders to think about is their own story and their own role in their brand power behind their businesses. So most of the most successful founders that we meet have an inherent belief in their product, inherent belief that they're right about their product and what it will take to get it out to market and to be successful. So that resilience, and I suppose that belief that never saying no, not taking no for an answer, that ability to just carry on is one of the core ingredients. And when we talk to investors, I would say 8 times out of 10, they will say it's not necessarily the product, it's the founder that they back, because the product could shift. There'll be pivots along the journey, might well be changes as they're scaling and thinking about international growth. But it's that founder kind of sentiment and belief, and then being able to carry that vision, being able to create the vision, articulate it, and carry it forward as their teams grow is perhaps one of the most important ingredients. And I think all too often founders forget that their own brand or their story is so much part of that, as well as putting their product out to market. It's that people want to back them. And so we do encourage kind of founders to think about that. And that's hard if you're an introvert, and often, founders can be, which is also why we often will suggest and look at, there'll be a co-founder story, whereas one might be the more technical background or more kind of into the product versus the go-to-market and being out to market. But in finding that right balance between how much time you spend internally within the company to externally to think about how you are promoting what you're building and what you're doing, I think is one of the critical ingredients.
I have an assumption that an investor's belief in the founder and their resilience and their vision, the importance of that changes depending on the stage. Earlier stage, it feels like one of the most important things. You pretty much only bet on the founding team. Whereas when you get to the growth stage, my assumption is that then becomes less of an importance. Is that right? Or am I a bit naive here?
No, I think that is still a factor. Naturally, sometimes the founders will exit at a certain point, or they might feel that now's the right time to bring in the CEO. I think that's more around the founder understanding themselves what their strengths are and what the right time is for their company to change hands, if it should. You see an awful lot about the founder mode that was only out, 18 months ago or a year ago, around, no, it's always should be, the founder should never let go. They're always right about what they're doing. To then potentially the point where it does come time to exit, in which case is that the right time for a different leader to come in and run the business. I think only the founder really knows that deep down. And yes, there is quite a lot around investors pushing them to make that decision, but I think in their hearts they're the ones that know. They might just need support along the way to know when the right time is.
Is there a specific stage where you find this question coming up a lot more?
I think often we see that founders haven't thought about the exit. And I don't know that it's necessarily one point in time. It's a milestone along the journey. But all too often they're so busy in building mode that thinking through what is the best exit, or how do I want to finish this journey or reach this milestone, or do I ever want to do that? In which case, am I just here and scaling the company forevermore? But I think most founders at some point want that break, want some liquidity, want to see perhaps a different kind of path in their journeys, or want to go again, want to build again, because they particularly like the earlier stage of the building, or don't particularly like all the operationally and managing large teams. So I think it really does come down to the individual and what they want to see. But typically it's probably starting to edge towards the Series D phase.
Series D?
Yes.
Oh, wow. I would have thought way earlier for some reason. I have it in my mind that it's more like a number of years in the business. And so then I think it's maybe 4 to 5 years that a founder gets to Series A, and sort of around the 5-6 year mark, or even 7, that they start questioning their position in the company and whether they like it anymore, and whether they still have the energy to keep going, which is sort of I think the thing that you hear from every entrepreneur is, if I knew how hard it was going to be when I got started, I probably never would have got started. And so, that's interesting.
That's so true, for sure. I think it depends though. Some companies now, I don't know if you can put a time frame on it, when some companies get to that stage far quicker than others. obviously AI is transforming the timescale of some of those journeys. So I think it really does come down to sector dependence. But you're right, it's far harder than probably anyone imagines. And so I do think that ends up being that question after a certain point in time. Is this the right thing to keep going?
So then if we zoom out a bit and think about Founders Forum Group, which you're the CEO of, ecosystem, is it 14 companies that you have within Founders Forum Group? Is that right?
I lose count.
You lose count.
I do lose count. We just launched 2 more in June. So it's yes.
Okay. So it's a proper portfolio of businesses.
Yes.
But you've said in other interviews that it's a very people-driven business. And so how have you built the systems and the habits within the group to protect the quality of those relationships as you scale internationally, as you add more businesses into the portfolio? How do you think about keeping that people-driven essence and soul?
I think there's probably 2 different components to it. So there's Founders Forum, which is the community driven largely by the events that we operate, and that's how we bring people together. So there's the sort of community of who are the founders and the investors and the CEOs and government and policy makers that are part of our ecosystem community. And then there are our portfolio companies, which ultimately what we're doing there is trying to create brilliant services for the community. So we've looked at, across your whole journey. We just talked about journeys earlier, from pre-seed all the way through to exit, and then perhaps going again. What are the services or supports that a founder might need on that path? And how can we create purposeful companies that help disrupt traditional business models or the traditional ways that those services are given, that are really designed for founders? And everything that we look at is just focused on the founder first. We design everything from thinking through what's the founder mentality and what's the support we can give. On the community side, how do we keep that people-oriented and focused? I think comes down to the level of curation that we put into all of the events and to the groups that we bring together. And predominantly we do that through recommendations. So we go out to the investors in our network, we go out to the CEOs, we go out to founders, and we ask them to recommend and put people forward, because I think you can't just only look at a metric around a valuation or amount raised. And those are obviously, they are key important factors to understand how a company's growing or how a founder's doing. But predominantly we want to hear from the ecosystem of people that are already in the network that we know and trust, about others that perhaps we haven't come across or thought of, or rising stars. This is a major component of what we love about Founders Forum, is discovering the next talent before perhaps others have, or before they're out there in the mainstream. So we love to shine a spotlight on that, but not only, I think, particularly founders, but disruptive technologies. So what are the new technologies coming to the fore? So that's the essence of, I think, just focusing around who are the right people to be in the room. And for us, we want it to be, if you come to a Founders Forum event, it's all the idea around being in a safe space. So leave necessarily the company troubles at the door, or company highs at the door. Come together knowing that we've curated a group that when you walk into that room, everyone will be interesting to you, and everyone will have an aspect of having something interesting to share with each other. And then off the back of that, how do you create peer-to-peer networks or contacts or supports? It's all about finding the right person at the right time that will help along that journey, and then perhaps creating conversations that you're not going to find on YouTube, that you're not going to find in the mainstream. But how, if we put interesting and inspiring people together, what's the outcomes and what's the conversations that can be driven forward from that? So that's the essence. How do we do it? If you mean how do we operate the company in a way that's still people focused? There is still a large amount of what we do that is just manual, and it is people having that awareness and knowledge around who's in the community. And we spend an awful lot of time way more time than perhaps people might think, literally looking at that curation and that detail. And yes, now it's fantastic. Most companies have got AI tools to support them. That means we can be more efficient and we can think about that on a global basis and we can think about scaling it. But it still inherently comes down to knowing a little bit about the individuals.
Quick 10-second pause to say that our newsletter is the highest value per sentence in your inbox. We share systems, prompts, and scripts that you can use today, because content without action is just noise. All the links in the description. Now, let's get back to the episode. I think curation is the absolute key to running incredible events. If you put all the right people in the room, it doesn't really matter what the room looks like because they'll have an amazing experience. But curation is very easy to say, but very hard to do very well. And so do you have any frameworks or rules, more so for who you say no to? Because that's a lot more difficult than saying yes. If a founder comes to you and says, I think this person should really come in, how often have you said, actually, no, I don't think they're the right fit for this reason, this reason, this reason?
I think we're pretty clear and open and honest when we get recommendations, perhaps companies that are either too early stage. So naturally, again, on that journey, founders have different pain points and different challenges at different stages. So actually for us, it's been a lot of the work we've done by bringing TechNation in has enabled us to almost do what we do at Founders Forum for perhaps later stage companies, for earlier stage companies. And then the conversations around talent or fundraising or meeting the right corporate partners or working through government systems and tools. There are different nuances and different conversations to be had. So we've been able to tailor those discussions far more. But I think we're fairly open and honest about where the value exchange will be between the attendees or between the communities. So there are plenty of times where we've sort of said no, and it's not through not wanting to have them, because we're not about volume, we're about the right people in the room, which is just really around being able to enable the right connections.
And then on this topic of creating a safe space that people can leave some of the company problems behind them and be present in the room. When I was running Founders, the reason that Founders didn't have investors is for that exact reason, that if your investor or your potential investor is in the room, how open and honest are you actually going to be? How do you potentially overcome this if sort of vulnerability and deep openness and honesty it is something that you're aiming for, or is it more sort of a practical approach? Because if you have potential people you're trying to sell to or potential investors, are you naturally not going to be a bit more reserved?
I think it can be both, and how we sort of manage that is everything that we have on site is Chatham House rule, but we do VC only sessions, we do founder only sessions. And again, we manage that very carefully. Same, we also do a sort of meet the CEO session where we will introduce founders to interesting and relevant CEOs within their sectors that could be potentially partners, mentors, allies, acquirers even along the way. So there is enough kind of curation of the different formats and settings that you'd be able to have that founder-to-founder moment, sharing perhaps your deepest, darkest challenges or opportunities, as you say, or that you can bring those ideas to the forefront. And again, similarly for the investors to actually discuss pain points they've got right now around deal flows or where they're seeing, again, greater opportunities or potential challenges in certain sectors. So we allow for those different moments across the curation, but then still allow kind of a broader network and broader connections to be made.
Which of those experiences do you find you get the strongest positive feedback from?
It's a mix, because I think it depends on the outcome. So what's always really lovely to see is when we get the kind of notes post-event about the experience, it's either that, I will hear time and time again that founders have made their deepest friends, the deepest friendships over the last 8 years of coming to Founders Forum. But then equally, I'll also hear tangible, I met so-and-so. As a result, we're going to do a collaboration. This is going to drive my business on exponentially. I've been able to meet so-and-so. I've been trying to meet this company for a long time. They've just been able to introduce me. When we hear those stories, and actually even, a funding round was closed on site at Founders Forum this year. So when you kind of hear those impacts, it's not something we track in great detail. We hear it more anecdotally, but that for us is a huge fuel for us to know that the impact we're making to keep going and keep doing more, and then wanting to keep doing it on a global stage makes it really, really rewarding.
Yeah, it does warm your soul when you get those sorts of bits of feedback, because running these sorts of events, running community is so time consuming, so energy consuming. And I feel like when I was doing it, those were very much the moments where I was like, oh, this is all worth it.
For sure. But also I think it's just spending time with the founders creating amazing companies. When you sort of literally from AI into drug discovery or impacts for climate, when you actually understand the kind of solutions that some of these founders are building, it's hugely energizing to see that. Or actually even for some founders that might be in just pure play fintech or in cloud or SaaS or whatever, but it's just interesting to see their growth stories and their ability to scale is really rewarding.
So speaking of these exceptional founders, from your viewpoint, what have you noticed are the mindsets, the habits, the beliefs of these really exceptional founders, above and beyond just good or even great founders? What really separates that top 5 or top 1%?
I find it varies a little bit, but if I really hone down, it's been that the founders known their product through and through and just had an unwavering sense of belief that it can work. So that resilience just to never say no or stop going. I think I've kind of referenced this already, but that is often what I find sets it apart. But then at the same time, not losing kind of sense of awareness of themselves and around them, and perhaps still also an ability to be kind and be human. Maybe that's just the ones that I prefer. But some of those are, for sure, I think, in the top 1%.
And have you seen those translate down into specific habits that these founders do, systems that they have for backing up these beliefs, this resilience, backing up their kindness and humanness, or really understanding their product or building awareness of the market? Are there anything tangible that you've seen?
I think probably the ability to have created a great culture and talent pool around them. So we're starting to see more of it in Europe now, but actually companies that have gone on and off the back of that, they've created 15 new founders that have gone on to create new companies, because while they've scaled and grown, they've still been able to foster that talent and that culture within their organizations that have still made them fantastic places to work and had that talent retention.
Who's a mafia builder that comes to mind when you think of this?
Quite a few of the fintechs really across Europe have seen that, and now have gone on to continue to build really good companies. So it was always the PayPal mafia was the shining example out of the US, but I think we do have companies now in Europe doing this.
Is there any founder that you really look to and go, oh wow, they've smashed it?
I would say someone like Ilkka Paananen from Supercell, still running the company, still unearthing an openness about the successes and honesty about failures, and I think truthfulness about how the company's growing, their attitude to culture is a standout for me.
Amazing. And so when you have these sorts of founders in mind, I'd love to break it down to the 2 areas of company building that feel consistent throughout the whole journey, which is sort of hiring and fundraising. And so you speak to the talent and the culture element, and we'll get onto the fundraising side. Is there anything that you've seen these founders do when it comes to hiring, retaining talent, building their culture that has really stood out as being, wow, you are one of 100 that actually put this into practice, or this feels very innovative?
I think they've had a very clear vision for the kind of companies that they want to build and the talent they want to bring in, and the ability to let their talent be, I suppose, open and free, but not have a fear of failure. And so actually, I mean, Ilka's an example where he talks about them almost celebrating when they've had a fail, to try and kind of reverse the culture of failure means doom, especially in, I suppose, a market like his where there will be one success out of many failures. It's been an important feature to consider that actually this, I think in too many organisations there is a real fear of failure and risk, and therefore the ideas don't come to the forefront in the first place. And that's a little bit perhaps more common in larger, more public organisations. But being able to actually truly create a culture like that, I think, is quite rare.
Do you know what they actually do in terms of celebrating failure? Do they have a drinks, a party? Do they have a...
Yeah. They will literally go and have a party to celebrate that failure.
Wow. That's awesome. I love that. How do you approach failure in Founders Forum?
I think I try and foster a sense of no blame. It's no one thing that will have contributed to that, and there's always a lesson to be learnt from everything, especially so when you're producing live events and community aspects. Nothing will ever go 100% perfectly right. That won't, will the client, will community sense all of that? Maybe not. We are perfectionists at our heart. We absolutely are. So that's a challenge in ourselves. But I think it's just honestly to break down what went wrong, if at all, and then to actually just go, right, how can we actually shift this to learn from it, and not spend too long focusing on that, but actually just focus on, right, well, what will we do differently for the next iteration?
When I chatted to your husband, Tom, before this, he said that you're a perfectionist, and that's the root to any sort of stress that you might have with your work is down to things not being perfect in your eyes. And so what's the narrative that you're trying to adopt more often to lean into these failures as opposed to the perfectionism? Or maybe what's the balance between these two? I'm aware of that in myself for sure. Therefore, I do try and hold that more inside as opposed to projecting that out as a leader. So if anything, I will take more of the blame personally than I will deflect. I think I will focus a lot more on just, well, what can we do differently? Or I'm quite solutions orientated. So again, it is just focus on, well, what would we change? What would we do differently? How can we find a solution for that? Let's move forward. I do try not to stay on the retrospective for too long. But I think I truly recognise that. But at times, I'll also recognise that sometimes speed is better than perfection and actually producing. So I will err on the sense of I'd rather it be 80% perfect, but on time, as opposed to 100%. I love this conversation around the balance between quality and speed, and the narrative in the startup world has been a lot more focused on speed than quality, which makes a lot of sense in that we are not 100% sure what quality actually looks like to our customers. And so the only way to know is you get things out there and then you get feedback and you iterate. And there are some areas of company building where we should move fast and break things. But I think there are also other areas where going slow and a bit more intentionally builds the best foundations. where do you think is the time and the place to go a bit slower, a bit more intentionally in company building?
Well, in the core of your product, ultimately, I think if you, especially at a launch phase, if you're just rushing that out, I think at least the core fundamentals of what it is and its value to its end customer is pretty critical not to rush for the sake of it. So those aspects. And team talent. I have probably still continue to on occasion rush recruit. And I think making sure that your talent is right is by far better than rushing and ending up with not the right people in your team, whether they're not the right culture fit, whether that kind of exchange and making sure that you're both good for each other is the best balance.
What do you think you need to change about your hiring system that would allow you to move slower with it?
Well, we've looked at actually just being more honest and open about who we are and therefore the right, who would be the right culture fit for us. What's the values of our organization? How do we operate? Who are we? What's the pace going to be like? And making sure that actually they meet as many team members as possible to get a kind of open view from across the team. And then setting out, and then also asking, the candidates what they're really looking for so that we can make sure that balance is there. It's always hard. I mean, when we move at the pace that we move, and therefore it can be all too easy a trait to just say, fine, we just need a body in. But that's never been proven true at the end.
Short-term thinking, isn't it?
Yes.
Deanne, your
chief of staff.
Chief of staff. She had wonderful things to say about you. She also told me that you've built this very strong loyalty throughout your career that has led to various people following you, including the Founders Forum CFO, Joe, Ellie Steele as well, who I believe is now the head of ops or the ops director. What is it about how you interact with people that has built this sort of emotional magnetism to you?
Oh, that's a big compliment. I think openness and honesty. So, and I'm a good communicator with the team. So I don't think I've ever believed in sugarcoating things. And I always want to work with individuals. So I'm a big believer in people development, only because to be honest, it really stems from what I would want myself. And I've always been very ambitious, very hungry to learn, always wanting to take on new ideas, possibly too much the shiny new thing, but I love to kind of look at new things, and therefore I want that for the individuals that work around me as well. I'm definitely a believer in people owning that themselves. So I like for people to either work in my teams or that work around me, I like to know what makes them tick, because ultimately, if people love what they do, they will enjoy it far more. They will get more out of it, but they will give far more as well. And I don't mean that in the sort of transactional sense. I do just mean I've been very fortunate to have always been in a career where I've loved what I do. And therefore that sense of self-satisfaction just meant I have brought my best self to work most of the time, certainly not all. And I recognise that in other people. So therefore I'm always keen to understand, what do they enjoy? What makes them tick? What are they looking for? And how can I help them on that journey? So, and I may not be able to do it all. And so equally, I think I've always been very honest when I can only take a person so far, and whether therefore that's either, we're no longer the right team for them because I can't give them the development opportunities that they're looking for, or because we're actually not the right organization to enable them to get those opportunities. And I'm talking across my whole career now. So I think I've always just been honest about the journey they were on. So, Joe, for example, reached a moment with us in our previous company where he couldn't get what he wanted for, and I knew he was capable of so much more. And unfortunately, that required him to leave the organisation to go to another to develop those. But then we have an opportunity where I could work with him again, and so off I went to go and get him to come and work with us. So I think it is just constantly being open and honest with each other. And if we're clear about what we're trying to achieve, and then it is that balance between what are we trying to achieve as a company? What are you trying to achieve as an individual? How much can we marry up? And that's rarely 100%. If it is, fantastic, and that would be my holy grail. Not always the case, but can we basically marry those two objectives as much as possible? Then I think you're on the right path.
Where do you find it hardest to be open and honest?
We had a situation in COVID where in my previous company running a huge live events organisation, and the reality is we didn't know. We didn't know what would happen in the markets. We didn't know when live events would come back. So, we were all sitting in various homes wondering how were we going to, get through this, and what were we going to do? And again, I was probably very open and honest with them that we didn't have all the answers, because we didn't. That's a hard thing to admit, because I probably like to solve problems and like to fix things in a perfectionist way. And we couldn't. So that was probably the hardest learning curve. But again, I think we just got through it by being able to admit that we didn't have all the answers. We could only see what was right in front of us, and could only control what we could control. And that was certainly not everything in those times.
Speaking of control, perfectionism generally stems from wanting to have as much control as possible. Whereas in company building, there are lots of things which are outside of our control. There are lots of things which are uncertain, and we have to move forward anyway. I would love to understand how your relationship with control has evolved over time.
Still absolute elements of perfection and control freak in me. Sometimes I'm not sure it's perceived as a bad thing. I like the ability to know the detail, but be able to come up to 30,000 feet as well. And that ability to go between the two, I think, is quite an important skill set when you're navigating companies and growth, and being able to understand when you need to be in the decision and when you don't. And that's definitely also been a learning curve over time. Most of my focus, I think, in more recent times has been just to almost every morning looking at what's in front of you and thinking, by the end of the day, what's the 3 things that I should have focused on that would truly make the difference, that only perhaps I can do, where I would make the difference, and just trust and enable that you've set your team up to handle the rest. But inevitably, there are 15 things every morning, and if I try to do all 15, then I won't do those very well. So that's definitely been a muscle that I've developed over time, to just think, literally, by the end of the day, have I achieved 2 to 3 things? Have I earned what my CEO salary should be worth? And that's just a question I ask myself in the morning and evening.
Quick 25-second pause, talk about how startup leaders are athletes of the mind. And just like an athlete, you should treat your health as your number 1 priority. You can't show up for others if you're depleted. You can't pour from an empty cup, which is why my friend Dan's company, Heights, is a partner of the show. Heights are the world's best brain and gut supplements. I've been taking Heights for a couple of years, and I feel like an elite mental athlete. It's a bit of a no-brainer. Click on the link in the description and start reaching your heights. Right, back to the episode. Amazing. So you have this sort of planning and reflection practice baked in. Are there any other awareness building practices that you have that help you get to the main thing?
It is planning. There is a lot of sort of planning and thinking ahead, and this ability to think. In my role, I have to think a year and a half ahead, and I have to think immediately what's in front of tomorrow. And again, it's still that constant an 80-20 rule, but that ability to make sure that you're still looking forward all the time while you're in the day-to-day and allowing for time for that.
Why 18 months?
Just the nature of sort of events and community planning.
Got you.
Means we're already thinking about the end of 2026.
Okay.
While we're right now in what's ahead of us this week.
Amazing. I find this ability to go from 30,000 feet down to the details is what makes founders who can scale with the business amazing. Brian Chesky talks about it a lot, where he loves being in the details, but also he's managing multiple tens of thousands of people. And so I feel like that versatility is really powerful. Are there any other versatilities that founders need in order to help them scale their business, going from big picture thinking to detail? Anything else where you have two ends of the spectrum that you need to learn how to balance doing both?
I think perhaps it's a little bit of what I touched on earlier, which is the external and internal balances, which is just around knowing how much time you should give to developing your profile and your story and how that can help amplify your business versus internal managing teams and product. So that recognition, I think, I've seen it in larger companies where, my previous role, I probably ended up being far too internal facing, as opposed to this role where I'm probably almost 80% external, out with sort of founders and clients and contacts in the ecosystem. That's helpful. And to be honest, it's not an either or, it's more a case of then making sure you've set up the team and structure around you that both get managed well. But sometimes you're the only one that can know your product externally from founder's point of view, and you're the only one that can go out there and truly be the face of it and sell it. So then it's just making sure there's enough time for that.
The other thing that came to mind was what you share externally with your team versus what is the voice or narrative in your head that you don't share, which is sort of the perfectionism point, right? You said keep a lot of the perfectionism inside and then pose a different narrative externally. That seems to be a challenge that so many founders face. It's what is the right information to share with whom. What you can share with investors is different from what you can share with your team, which is different from what you can share with your co-founder, which is maybe different from what you're actually thinking. Where have you found that this tension comes up the most, or is maybe the hardest to balance?
I think it depends on your cultures and team structures that you've set. The way I look at it is almost building that team around me who I'll share everything with, and then knowing what to communicate and how to communicate out to your teams, and just finding that right balance, as well as external support or advisors potentially as well. So just managing that support ecosystem around you as sort of founder CEO is pretty critical.
Is there a time that you've got it wrong that was a really steep learning curve?
The COVID times were hard. We're very much learning on the fly, and we had to go through quite a hefty redundancy process. And there were times where I felt we could have balanced more of the human aspect to that. But it was hard within the constraints of the process we were going through as well. So try to do that as much as possible. But that was a lot harder. That was a lot harder on me personally than probably people would appreciate that, balancing that, needing to be a leader and face of the organisation versus perhaps how you privately felt about it. But again, there are times where you have to find the right mix.
What would have being more human about it look like?
Well, I think that's hard because you couldn't necessarily tell people whether they were going to be safe or not. So, and we didn't necessarily know those outcomes either. So it would have been nice not to have to put people through a lengthy process. But that was the situation we were in. So I think even now, generally, we always have to think through the humanity behind some of the decisions you have to take. But that's leadership.
I was speaking to a European founder who ended up closing down his company and going to the US. And he's now working in a very fast scaling company in San Francisco. And when I was talking to him about the difference between US founders and European founders, he said that when it comes to specifically firing decisions, US founders are just ruthless. And even their employment contracts are structured such that you can be fired on the day and leave without any sort of notice, which feels like not the most human process. And he said that this is what he thought the European ecosystem was missing, was structures and beliefs and systems which are actually far more decisive and far more focused on the speed element, which potentially comes at the detriment of the human element. How do you think about this if we're banging the drum for the UK or Europe being as strong a tech ecosystem as Silicon Valley?
So I would say there's probably more of a slightly fairer balance of time and speed within that. But I don't disagree that I think sometimes we can delay decisions. And is that the best thing for the individual if it isn't the right fit? So I spoke earlier a little bit about fit and the honesty when it's not the right fit. And again, I think through time, I've probably been far quicker to make decisions around it not being the right fit and letting people go. Fundamentally, I think it's fairer than trying to drag something on that isn't right for the individual, because clearly that individual has talents and will be great somewhere else or great in another situation. Could even be the same company but a different time in that company's journey. Companies go through different phases of when they suddenly need different skills and different talent and different pace. So I do think you have to be honest with the employees about when that right time is. And I'm sort of probably a little bit more on the speed of decision with that. It's probably actually slightly slower pace of hiring, slightly faster pace of decision about whether the individual's in the right role. And that's not to say it couldn't be moved around the company. But yes, I probably would say speed of that decision is more helpful than not, even though it might feel more brutal at the time.
Short run pain, long run gain for everyone.
Do the right thing for the individual and right thing for the company, provided I think there's a fairness around remuneration or exit package or what have you.
Yeah, and I suppose that also comes back to your skill and value of openness and honesty and being clear as kind, as opposed to sort of stringing someone along and telling yourself a story that they might be right at some point in the future, as opposed to being very clear.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that.
Coming near to the last sort of section of this, I would love to understand more about you as the human and where these different elements of yourself have come from. When I spoke to Tom, he spoke about your work ethic, your drive, your ambition that you mentioned. And then in another interview that I listened to that you were in, you spoke about your the phrases that your dad put into you, which says you only get out what you put in, and if you don't ask, you don't get. Can you speak to that relationship between you and your dad and the impact that your family had on your work ethic and this drive?
Yes. So I come from, small but very close family. I would say I have two siblings, and we all demonstrate the same work ethic that I think we saw through my father, who worked incredibly hard to essentially, he was a massive believer in education and wanted to ensure we had the best education possible. And so had worked, 2 to 3 different roles, ran a company alongside a full-time teaching role, using his musical talent, but ultimately did all of that to provide his 3 children with the best education possible. I was incredibly fortunate to win a scholarship to go to a boarding school. I grew up in North Wales. The school was outside London. It was a very big life changer for me in the access and to the education that it gave me, and therefore the opportunities. And I suppose I was drilled with a deep sense of independence. Yes, you will only get out what you put in, that you should own it. Perfectly fine. I think the don't ask, don't get is actually more just knowing how to work with people to get support.
Sounds like you have very high standards for yourself. And as you say, you can't ask anyone else what you wouldn't do yourself. A challenge that I've heard so many different leaders speak about, CEOs, but also just leaders in companies, is what is the balance between unreasonableness and pushing people and getting the best out of people and encouraging high performance. Can you push somebody as hard as you push yourself? Is that fair? How do you think about this balancing act when it comes to leading people versus leading yourself?
I do have high expectations, but I also recognize what I want to do for myself, not necessarily what others would want to do. So I'm not tone deaf to that. I think I have quite a strong sense of what I think is fair. So perhaps firm but fair has been a label that I've been given in the past, but I think I have an expectation of what I want us to achieve, and I want us all to work as a team to achieve that. But I think I also still haven't, there's still very much the fairness aspect to that. What is reasonable? People might have their own definitions of that, but I would always be open for people to challenge what isn't, and then to show me an alternative for us to work that through. And I'm open to being challenged, because it's true. I would just keep going.
What about some of these fast scaling founders? Do you find that they have a similar level of reasonableness, or are they lower on that spectrum?
Typically not, but I think sometimes that's just what it takes to get their companies to the growth that they need to be. I think then it's probably the right. Then perhaps you have to recognise what's the right team structure to put around you to, ensure that you're still building the culture and team that you want to. But I think sometimes a little bit of unreasonableness is what you actually need to succeed.
Have you heard of an example of someone being reasonable and still building a huge unicorn or decacorn or world-changing company?
Plenty, I'm sure, but I don't think it's all one reasonable, all one unreasonable. I think there's probably moments where it's called for.
How would you? What some of those moments do you think?
Clearly when you're trying to launch new products or you're trying to go into new markets, sometimes you just need that pace and resilience that others might well call unreasonable. And if you're not in it to win it, then.
Speaking of, you are expanding internationally, aren't you?
Yes.
And
yes.
so
yeah.
how reasonable are you being at the moment versus how much you're pushing the team?
I think we have to understand our markets. So we're brilliantly placed in the UK to actually geographically and physically for time zones and to operate in different markets. But actually there's different nuances and cultures. And so we took the decision to hire people locally in Singapore with time zones and also just with understanding the community and different nuances there. And I think just to manage our kind of pace and volume, and we do a lot of work with governments, and so actually having people on the ground and understanding that a lot of that needed to be face to face as opposed to Zoom, the power of face to face is not lost, was critical. So we've decided to where we would have physical boots on the ground versus actually able to do it from our team in the UK until perhaps we might be large enough in those regions to think about having local teams as well.
Love it. Going back to you, just thinking of the last couple of questions I have time for. Something that's universal across founders and leaders is the pressure that we're under. And we've spoken about perfectionism, we've spoken about control, but we haven't spoken about stress. I don't know a founder that hasn't gone through intense levels of stress and pressure. And so I'd love to hear how you approach dealing with stress from an internal narrative perspective, from a habit perspective. Yeah, I'd love to speak to stress.
So for me, there's been times, I think, along my career journey where, had knocks or decisions or challenges which you could just say, well, I'll give up from that then. Or that's fine. I'm maybe not cut out to do this, or I'm not going to be able to achieve this. And I think it's probably that inner voice to yourself, which has just gone, you can take that approach, or you can just believe in yourself a little bit more. That sounds very cheesy that I wouldn't normally say. But I've chosen in those moments to probably go, no, I've got to back myself. Because at the end of the day, no one else necessarily, lots of people will, but if you don't back yourself, then why should others? So I've taken that choice to think, well, you've just got to build back up from it and learn and carry on. So I've probably built far more inner resilience than I thought I had. And I think that might speak to lots of founders. The stress is always real and alive. I think it's often knowing whether, now for some, obviously they are, but I'm not performing life-saving surgery every minute. Therefore, there are solutions, there are ways forward, you would come out of it. It's around just trying to break it down so that you can deal with it in the very here and now and still find that path forward. Exercise has probably been my discovery in the last 5-6 years or so, where actually wake up feeling all sorts of stress points and concerns and go for a run and feel entirely differently when I come back. And while at the time I'm not sure I've got the time for it, actually that 25 minutes can change the whole path for your day before I then think through what are the 3 things I need to do today. So that's been my main learning. Might find other forms naturally, but I think it probably just is that moment to think and to get past your inner voice.
It's really powerful. I'd love to zoom out to the 30,000 feet level. Given that you work so hard and the rest of the time you spend with your family, if we merge those two worlds, if your kids saw exactly how you worked and how you thought about work, what would you love for them to take on and adopt, and what would you love for them to not?
I think just what I'd love for them to adopt is that there's not only one route, and therefore, with all the kind of talk about AI and job changes and everything else, that they just remain curious and have fun while doing so. So, I was saying earlier, I've just been very, very fortunate to be quite a people person, to work in a people-orientated role, and just had the real good fortune of loving what I've done and really enjoying working with the people that I've worked with or interacted with, and have got so much from that. So I would love for them to find that secret sauce in whatever that is that they would want to do. And what I would love for them not to do is to take themselves too seriously along the way.
And you feel like you're taking yourself too seriously along the way?
Absolutely at times, but generally always with a smile and humour.
What does that look like? What does taking yourself too seriously look like when it surfaces?
Probably the perfectionism, therefore the blame on yourself, or making you carry everything and thinking you are the only one that can carry it all, is probably one of the kind of biggest learnings that I could still learn from. But I do take responsibility.
You very much do, and that's shone through in this interview. This has been absolutely amazing. The closing tradition that we have on this show is, because you've been so generous with your time, and assuming this is listened to by an audience of entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs, what is something a community of entrepreneurs could support you with?
Recommendations of other brilliant founders that we may not know about, that we can help along their journeys.
Love it. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.